Fred, I was very impressed and inspired by your attempt to return to philosophical anthropology. For a while, people characterize my work in the Confucian tradition as in the spirit of philosophical anthropology, but I never noticed. Of course, I had some inkling, never noticed such a powerful movement in the West ever since Schiller.
Yes. Now, philosophical anthropology was very strong in Western philosophy during the 19th century and the early 20th century. There were some major figures, like Max Scheler, was a student of Husserl. And also Plessner. So these were major figures in philosophical anthropology, and they developed a conception of the human which overcame the Cartesian tradition of splitting the human in mind-body, mind-body, mind-matter. So that was a very significant effort, and it continued until the mid-20th century. But then, for a number of reasons, it became unpopular. It became unpopular. And one reason, as I tried to point out, one reason is the upsurge or the rise of postmodernism. And the idea of the end of man, the death of man, the death of the subject. So much of French philosophy was very anti-humanist. Anti-humanist. And that was particularly evident in the early works of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Now later they changed.
I think toward the end of Foucault, for example, he became very deeply concerned about the care of the self.
Precisely. He wrote about that, his care of the self. So but since that time, I think a change has happened, and there's a resurgence of philosophical anthropology, or concern about the meaning of what is human, the human being. And again, there are a number of factors which play a role here, but especially the resurgence of phenomenology and of also humanistic psychology. And
even like Erikson.
I
actually studied with him. And the whole question of identity. And different stages of human self-realization. Maslow probably is another one.
Maslow, So there's a coming together, it seems, of some of the humanistic traditions of the 19th, early 20th century, and some of the newer direction in psychology and also in neuropsychology, in neuroscience. They begin to meet again and to articulate a conception of the human which is no longer purely mentalist, nor purely naturalist, but a conception which is truly, shall I say, bifocal, which sees the human through both eyes. And I find this very, very fascinating. I myself have been strongly influenced for a long time by Merleau-Ponty, Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Importance on the body.
The embodiment, absolutely. Without neglecting the mind or the spirit, but the spirit is always embodied, and that is a very important thing. And I'm just now working on a major work which Merleau-Ponty wrote just before his death. He passed away early, which is his lectures on nature, including human nature. And he relies there very strongly on the classical tradition, German idealism, Hegel, Schelling, but then he moves to more recent philosophy, Henri Bergson, William James, and then into very recent developments in neuroscience. So that I find absolutely fascinating.
That's right. I think I try to develop an idea based upon the Chinese notion about the body. But the word can be used as a verb. Embodiment is part of it.
I see.
And so the body is not only an object. You don't own your body.
Precisely.
You become your body. And the body, in a way, is an attainment. As a young person, you gradually try to learn how you integrate your body. And I think not only it's not different from the heart and mind, even the soul and spirit are integral part. So the body in this case is a holistic concept. The idea, I think we're in a stage where the idea of the human has to be rethought and reformulated. And I think definitely beyond the Cartesian exclusive dichotomy. In the Great Learning, for example, there are dichotomies, but like yin and yang, complementary. So the distinction between the mental and physical, the sacred and profane, mind and body, all distinctions turn out to be outmoded.
I fully agree with you. I think the distinctions are not totally eliminated, but there's a new idea of complementarity. These things are complementing each other, not contradicting each other, not conflicting with each other, but they are supporting each other in a complementary way. And so mind and body, soul and spirit, all of these are not necessarily the same thing, but they are mutually interrelated and interacting. And this, I think, is a new way of thinking about the human being.
My position probably is a bit more radical. That is, in the original conception of the human, the separation itself is problematical. Like the basic idea of the vital energy. Bergson may talked about it. But Bergson is too biological to some of the Chinese philosophers. And this idea of the human is by nature integration of the two. It's almost impossible to imagine you can think pure thought like the Cartesian without involving the body, the sentiments, the idea. So it's not a dialectic relationship. It's a dialogical one.
A dialogical relationship. That's what I have in mind. It's complementary in the dialogical sense. Of course, the body is presupposed in every act of thinking, any mental reflection, and yet reflection has to come in to supervene on the body to make the body reflective. So there has to be this mutual relationship. So in the same way, we talked a little bit about the three dimensions of the cosmos, the divine and the human. They're not necessarily the same, but they are mutually so closely interrelated that it's very difficult to separate them in any way. Anyway, they only make sense with each other, right? So that's how I would see it. Also, the sacred and the secular, all of these things are so closely related that none of them make sense without the other.
When Fingeret talks about Confucius, the secular as sacred. So the idea of our ordinary experience of relating, of self-understanding, of even walking and drinking and eating, all these are not simply, quote, secular events. They are sacred in the sense sometimes ultimate meaning of life is realizable or even ought to be realized in ordinary human existence. So if you follow this line of thinking, I would suggest maybe 4 dimensions. And I think totally in agreement with you about 3. And first is the question of the self. And so I think the failure of some of the dichotomous thinking is inattention to the question of self-realization. So the true self, the subjectivity, is radically different from the false self. So the dichotomy, the exclusive dichotomy is the true self and subjectivism. So the true self is not at all in conflict with the objective world or with the transcendent. So these 3 dimensions you mentioned, cosmos, may very well be related to the issue. It's all right, you have to find.
Beethoven comes in. It's nice to be interrupted by Beethoven.
Yeah, maybe just let it go anyway. If you can close that, it would be nice. Turn it off. But otherwise, it's fine.
I turned it off, but there is another one.
Yeah, that's all right.
This one is.
This you cannot do anything about.
So,
Yeah.
they're okay?
Let's assume. I think resume. I think the question of the self, it's already almost embodied itself. There's a continuous interaction, hopefully fruitful interaction with many different dimensions of community, from the family, nation, and even the world. Yeah. And then community is not the Hobbesian idea of contract. And then cosmos is nature, like earth, and that heaven is the transcendent. It's the center of spirituality. And so how the person, as the center of relationships, rather than an isolated individual, will be able to interact with various ideas of the community, and how human species will maintain a sustainable relationship with nature or earth, and how the human heart and mind can develop sometimes in the Chinese case, the mutuality, mutual responsiveness, but sort of harmonious understanding between the human and the transcendent.
Yes. No, I fully agree with you. And I particularly like this emphasis on the self learning about itself in the process of relating, to the world and to the divine. Now, this you also have written about the process of self-transformation. Yes. So how we develop from a sort of mundane self into a fully mature self, which properly relates to other dimensions of the world. I think that is very, very crucial. And as you know, I've recently did this book, which is subtitled A Pedagogy for Troubled Times. Yes. So it's meant as a learning experience, a learning.
The good life, the quest for the good life.
Yeah. And this notion of the good life also resonates with what you're saying about the community, that we should start from the community conception and not from the social contract. Yes. So the idea of the good life is in opposition to the whole modern philosophy of politics, which is grounded on individual self-interest, which leads to a social contract, and then a political community which is a pure artifact or a machine, So it's in opposition to this very self-centered conception of modernity, which is rooted in the social contract. Yeah. So the idea of the community, the focus on a political community which is oriented toward achieving a better life. And the goal is the good life. The good life not for an individual, but for the whole community. This is a conception which derives originally from Aristotle. It's the Aristotelian tradition and not the Hobbesian tradition.
Sure. I think in a way, the idea of the good life as a continuous process of learning, which means self-realization, and evokes a sense of the transcendent.
Yes.
In other words, it's not the secular age which Charles Taylor talks about, but beyond the secular age. And that's the reason I think you probably, is it a Heideggerian notion or not? The idea of the human is not anthropological, because the anthropological world is too restrictive. Precisely. Fully human has to go beyond anthropocentrism. That's the reason I believe that both anthropological and cosmological, therefore, and kind of an anthropocosmic vision. You use a term comparable.
Yes. Well, Heidegger speaks of human being or Dasein as an ecstatic creature. Now, ecstatic means really standing out from the self, from the anthropological, standing out into the world, nature, but also to the divine. So it's an ecstatic relation with all the other dimensions, of which the human being is only one part, one
Yes,
particle,
yes.
an important part, but only one part. So for me, Heidegger articulates precisely this kind of multidimensional conception of the world in which the sacred and the secular and the immanent and the transcendent are closely related together without being totally fused with each other, but closely related and mutually dependent on each other, mutually dependent,
Yes.
as you say, in a dialogical way. And all of it involves a constant process of learning, pedagogy, of self-transformation. Now this is where I'm, a little bit hesitant to embrace the phrase, Fingeret's phrase, the secular is sacred. I very much appreciate Fingeret's idea, and I'd like to agree with it. However, there is in our present-day world so many things which by no stretch of the imagination can be considered as sacred. For instance, genocide, Holocaust, killings, war. So there's so much in the secular world which is so hideous, which is so obscene, that it cannot possibly be considered sacred. So in order for the secular and the sacred to come together, the secular has also to be transformed.
Yes.
There has to be a learning experience.
Well, transformed by the secular.
Precisely. There has to be a learning experience. There has to be a transformative experience so that we can really see the secular world as a sacred ritual.
Right.
A ritual of...
Yeah, this reminds me the whole conception of heaven or the transcendent. I think in the Confucian point of view, of course, the highest manifestation of self-realization is the unity between the human and heaven. So, which means a transcendent dimension which separates the human from especially the negative features of the secular world. And yet, this idea of heaven, it's omnipresent, omniscient, but not, it's unlikely to be omnipotent. Part of the reason is because of the advent of the human. And not just freedom, I think many philosophers talk about, but also responsibility. Earlier there was the notion that heaven engenders or creates, but human completes. It's almost like a partnership. So a human being is an observer, an appreciator, but also a participant, and of course difficult for people who are in the monotheistic tradition to accept the notion about co-creator. By implication, this creature who is so powerful can become powerful is also potentially a destroyer. So the notion about all these atrocities are not necessarily related to evil in the ontological sense. It is the failure of the human. Since you also deeply concerned about political philosophy, so how you link this process of secularization with politics? Because normally, under the influence of the liberal tradition, there's so much emphasis on the procedural process. So religion and concern for spirituality are relegated to the background as the matter of the heart, and whereas the politics, ever since Machiavelli and so forth, is a different kind.
I mean, I have been very greatly influenced also by your writings and very much attracted to the Confucian tradition. It resonates with many of the things that I have learned, but that Western modernity has forgotten to a very large extent. My basic tradition comes from Aristotle's teaching in the ethics, the Nicomachean ethics, in his politics, where politics is
virtue ethics.
It's virtue ethics, and politics is basically a virtuous activity oriented toward the good life for Aristotle. Now then, the Middle Ages, this was reformulated in a more theological way. In modernity, it was pushed aside by this idea of individuality and the social contract, and especially Thomas Hobbes' philosophy was enormously destructive. But then from Aristotle, I built a link or a bridge to Hegel, whom I considered the great modern philosopher who has rescued or salvaged some of the ideas of the Greeks, of Aristotle especially, with his idea that the political community is governed by Sittlichkeit. That means an ethical life.
Yes.
Ethical life is at the core of political life for Hegel, you know. So from Aristotle to Hegel and then to modern contemporary philosophy, I find a linkage again to Heidegger and Dallmayr and Merleau-Ponty, who also recapitulate this idea of politics and political life as an ethical life, ethical community. So for me, this resonates very, very much with the Chinese, the Confucian tradition. All of this has also led me to a certain questioning of some of the premises, especially of Abrahamic tradition, of Abrahamic religions. Now also I myself come from a Christian background, you know, Catholic, Protestant, but still I've come to question some of the premises, especially the idea of a creator God who is initially totally divorced from the world.
Yes.
The world is purely an act of will by this creator God, but the creator God could also be without the world. So there's not that relationship between God and world, which I would prefer to see.
It's
you know,
called the mutual responsiveness.
Yes. So for me, I prefer to think that God only becomes God through the world.
Yes, yes.
And the world also becomes only world, properly speaking, through the divine. So this interrelation leads me to a certain criticism of an extreme conception of transcendence, where transcendence is totally outside.
The holy other.
The holy other, totally outside of all relationships. So that I've become critical of. I think one can reformulate the Christian tradition also in a different way.
I think with the emergence of our concern for the earth.
Yes.
So any tradition, whether Buddhist or Christian, will have to develop two very different conceptions of their role as human beings. First, specific language to their faith community, but there's also the need for global citizenship.
Right.
You know, like in the Buddhists, they call themselves engaged Buddhism. But I think the two challenges I would see, one from the liberal, is say politics is so different from morality, from religion, and so-called, private matters or matters of the heart. The other one from Foucault and others becomes so much obsessed with the question of power, with the question of influence, the question of symbolic control, and the not only subjectivity, but true relationship with the virtue ethics of Aristotle, or the idea of self-realization in the Confucian tradition. And of course, you mentioned the whole question about subjectivity have been relegated to the background. And I think I gathered the return of philosophical anthropology is an attempt to retrieve some of the great humanistic traditions in the West, and with a view toward the future. And I think I very much in agreement with this approach. I learn a lot from your linkage between. You actually been practicing philosophical anthropology for a long time, and the linkage of that to the idea of the political order. And so, in the Confucian tradition, the self-realization, regulation of family, and peace in the world, this is all interconnected with a major enterprise. So I think related to this philosophical anthropology, which has to transcend anthropocentrism, a new kind of humanism. I mentioned that the Indian scholar Bala Subramanian would consider that as a kind of spiritual humanism. Humanism which is naturalistic and spiritual. It's not denatured or despirited.
I've been very much influenced, as you know, by Indian tradition, Indian thought, because I've spent a lot of time in India. And one of my mentors has always been Gandhi, and his kind of spiritual humanism, ethical humanism, also non-violent politics, And I've become very critical in the last 10, 20 years of what is called liberalism. What you describe, as this emphasis on individual self-interest, on human freedom. Now, there's a great value in human freedom, but the problem with liberalism is they have misconstrued the idea of freedom.
Yes.
Freedom is very valuable, of course, but there is a misconception of human freedom that it just means that I can do what I please. Freedom really means to do what is right, the ability to do what is right. This is the intrinsic conception of freedom, and the great tradition of German idealism, especially in Kant and Hegel, still was fully aware of this fact. Freedom, yes, but freedom has to be rooted in a conception of goodness, of what is right. So, liberalism, if it is not misinterpreted, if it is seen that freedom is really a freedom of rightness. And the other thing I have become very critical of, that kind of Foucault that you mentioned, not the late Foucault of the care of the self, but the Foucault only concerned with power. Now, I have recently written some very strong articles against one of the major proponents of the identification of politics with power. It's the German legal theorist Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt has become so popular in recent times, especially among young people, young political philosophers, who think, well, everything is power. They are the powerful people, in governments. So the only thing we can do is to have a revolution and have ourselves in power. So just one power for another power. So that identification of politics with power, to me, is completely wrong. Because politics, for me, and this is in the Aristotelian tradition, means the search in a community for a good ethical life.
Yes.
How can we live together? Right. That's the issue of politics for me. Yes. That's the political issue. How can we live together decently, caringly for one another? That is the issue of politics. But the Schmittians, they completely eliminate this. And they just say, no, it's all a struggle for power, friend, enemy. That's the mantra.
Yes. I think politics, in the Confucian tradition, is glossed with the same pronunciation as the other zhen, which means rectification.
Yes.
In other words, it's a way of finding a niche in the society, but the niche is not fixed. It's fluid. But you share part of your responsibility, what Henry Osborne and others will talk about, the role, ethics. And that sense, you can say, to provide the minimum condition, security and food and so forth, for human flourishing. That's the purpose of rectification. Rectification of the names of father, son, and friend, siblings, even ruler and ministers. And this process of rectification is a process of searching for the good life, not rooted in individuality, but rooted in a communal participation. However, one thing I think I don't agree with the role ethics argument is that there is the idea of subjectivity. In other words, you realize yourself for the sake of the self, not for the sake of anyone else. So the dignity of the person, even human rights, are part of this discourse. And once you become rooted in yourself as a kind of lived concreteness, and it's not privacy, it's a profound sense of personal investment, because being personal means being experientially committed.
And
therefore, responsibility and a sense of civility, they all enter into the picture. So this is, in this sense, I think I can now see politics as an integral part of not only the human community, but the cosmos on the one hand, and heaven on the other. I mentioned that I was happily surprised that someone in Switzerland, in this dissertation, talked about my work as a form of political philosophy. First, I was surprised. I thought I never did it. But like you've been always involved in philosophical anthropology, but now in a very articulate and conscious sense, you want to bring it back.
Well, I have always seen your work both as a form of Confucian philosophy, but also as political philosophy. It's politically eminently relevant for our time because it can correct, it can rectify,
Yes.
some of the mistakes that Western
That's
politics.
the Confucian, basic Confucian premise.
Yes, and rectify also, but the mistakes that we have made in Western politics, by overemphasizing something, which is completely misleading us, and not emphasizing things which ought to be emphasized. So this kind of rectification, I've always found in your work and very relevant for contemporary political philosophy. One thing I want to add is I fully agree with you that the self is, of course, also remains important. We are emphasizing community, but the community only has some meaning if the self is meaningfully involved in this community and freely involved in this community. So it's not just, as you say, a role conception, I play a role because that role is assigned to me. No, I freely, from my own self, I participate in this community, and this is a shared freedom. So community is a sharing of freedom. So that I fully agree with you, because otherwise it becomes just a sociological conception. Ethics is reduced to sociology, and this
It's
cannot.
not good enough.
Yes. I was very much impressed once. I listened to the Dalai Lama, and he was asked about political life. And he travels so much and he gives speeches so much. And he says, well, the best kind of life is that where you're actively involved in communities and political life, but then at least for a month or 2 months of your year, you should retreat into monastery or in some kind of retreat.
Self-reflection.
Self-reflection, right? And I thought, that's just right. That's just right. One has to care for self, but also for the community. And I cannot properly care for the community if I have not cared for myself.
I think Richard Rorty's sharp distinction between self-realization and social service, it's basically unworkable. You suffer from a kind of schizophrenia.
Yes.
And I'm reminded of William James' very seminal idea that without the individual impulse, society stagnates. But without the sympathy of the community and individual impulse fades away. I think this mutuality is absolutely critical.
Yes.
Well, we talked more than half an hour. Thanks a lot.
It was a great pleasure talking with you.
We'll continue.
I hope so.